Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Nick Marshall. I'm the head of exhibitions and programs here at the Eastman Museum. Tonight's conversation with Joshua Rashaad McFadden, Tate Shaw, and Dr. Keith Jenkins is in conjunction with the exhibition Joshua Rashaad McFadden, I Believe I'll Run On, which is currently on view in our main galleries through June 19th. This conversation and all programming related to the exhibition have been generously sponsored by the Lipson Visiting Artist Fund. We are immensely grateful for the support that is enabling us to bring meaningful and important conversations to our community and to be able to share them more broadly online. We are recording this evening's talk, so hopefully it'll be on our YouTube page in the coming weeks, and if you want to go back and revisit it or share it with friends, I would encourage you to do so. I Believe I'll Run On is an early career retrospective exhibition and forthcoming publication of Joshua Rashaad McFadden's work from the past 10 years, spanning genres ranging from portraiture, social documentary, reportage, fine art, and the family archive. The 7 series that comprise the exhibition reveal a layered, nuanced, and poetic view of Black life in America today. Dr. Heather A. Shannon curated the selection of objects in the exhibition along with Joshua Rashaad, and Dr. Jared Richardson wrote the accompanying interpretive texts. The focus of tonight's conversation will be on McFadden's Evidence series. As guest curator, Dr. Richardson writes, quote, "Evidence is a multimedia and multi-site project of positive self-making for contemporary Black men. Inspired by abolitionist and Rochester resident Frederick Douglass and his antebellum newspaper, The North Star, McFadden's series consists of photographic prints and a newspaper furnished with an array of voices and images. The publication features conversations and writings by cultural figures alongside McFadden's sitters. In addition to critiquing the rigidity of gender binaries, this collection of images and texts attempts to wrest Black men away from a white gaze and generate a readership independent of mass media stereotypes. The handwritten notes function as an open diary. They detail Black men's inner lives as related to issues of race, sexuality, fatherhood, and fraternity. Douglass, who is often cited as the most photographed person of the 19th century, deeply valued and supposed objectivity attributed to the photographic medium. In McFadden's hands, the camera becomes a witness of subjects who occasionally exceed the conventional boundaries of Black masculinity," end quote. There are 2 reasons I wanted to focus on this particular series tonight. Although the date is not recorded, Frederick Douglass estimated that he was born in February 1818. And chose his birthday to be celebrated on February 14th. Since this is Douglass's chosen birth week, and I'm sure he is on many people's minds, this seemed like a great opportunity to talk about McFadden's Evidence project in relation to Douglass and his influence. The second reason is that this body of work was originally exhibited at the Visual Studies Workshop in early 2020, but due to the pandemic, it was cut short, and they did not really have an opportunity to have larger conversations around the work. So I'd like to take that opportunity to do so now. Artist, writer, curator, and director of Visual Studies Workshop, Tate Shaw, will lead the conversation this evening. In June of this year, Tate's essay, "Effective Misplacement in the Image City," will be included in the forthcoming collection, Rereading Empathy, edited by Alyssa Carl and Emily Johansson. Published by Bloomsbury. And I mention that because Tate specifically dives deep into Joshua's work and some other projects that have happened around Rochester, and kind of contrasting and comparing those in a very new and progressive way of thinking about empathy and photography. So I encourage you all to check that out when it comes out. Maybe you'll get a little bit of a glimpse of some of the things that Tate's thinking about this evening. Joining Tate on stage, we will have Dr. Keith Jenkins, Vice President and Associate Provost for Diversity and Inclusion at RIT. Professor Jenkins' scholarly publications and presentations centered around studies in intercultural communication, political and visual rhetoric, and the rhetoric of gospel song. Most recently, the focus of his research has been on pragmatism and the rhetoric of inclusion in Barack Obama's 2008 presidential campaign. And of course, we have artist Joshua Rashaad McFadden, whose works have been exhibited internationally and have been published in the New York Times, Slate Magazine, Time Magazine, and Smithsonian Magazine. And in addition to his very robust assignment-based works, McFadden is also an assistant professor of photography at RIT. I want to briefly go back to the publication I mentioned earlier to let you know that we should be receiving the first round of copies of the book in a few weeks. And I know a lot of you have been waiting a while. And I want to let you know that they will be available in the store, and we are planning to do a book signing and conversation with Joshua Rashad and Lyle Ashton Harris on April 7th, and that's a Thursday, at 6 p.m. So please get that on your calendar, and I hope you're able to join us that evening. And the book is gorgeous. We got advanced copies, and the printing is beautiful, and the work is phenomenal. Due to the film screening at 7:30 tonight, we're going to try to end the program as close to 7 o'clock as possible. If there's time after for conversations, I'll try and come around with a microphone. If not, we are going to go down to the gallery. The galleries are open until 8 o'clock tonight. Please feel free to come down there, check out the show, come chat with us, and we'll be hanging out down there. So please join me in welcoming Joshua Rashaad McFadden, Dr. Keith Jenkins, and Tate Shaw.
So just a little grounding before we get started, and my connection to Joshua Rashad. I'm a photo book enthusiast, so first bought Come to Selfhood, which is in the exhibition here, one of the bodies of work in 2017, and learned about Joshua Rashad's work around then. I was preparing for this event we used to do a visual studies workshop pretty frequently called the Photo Book Work Symposium, and I was planning on having Joshua Rashad or inviting Joshua Rashad, and then immediately, as soon as I bought this book, I think from him directly perhaps, he applied for a residency at the Visual Studies Workshop, and then in January of 2019, we were thrilled to have Joshua Rashad in residence, and at that point, the curators of the Eastman Museum, at that time, Lisa Hostetler and Heather Shannon were invited to look at Joshua Rashad's work and sort of participate in dialogue with him about that. And also, I think like 4 weeks later, you were then interviewed at RIT for the assistant professor job that you currently have. So it's like all this confluence of institutional capacity, I think, that is super exciting. All because of the capacity in your practice and your work that brings this all together in this way. So it's one of those moments where I'm quite thrilled to be a part of the community in Rochester and have those institutional connections can get made in this kind of small environment. Another kind of institution of Rochester being Frederick Douglass. So I'll start with that as a kind of point of entry with this notion of Douglass being the most photographic public figure perhaps of the 19th century and our thinking of that. A photo historian, Alan Sekula, wrote about the everyday images of the 19th century in his really great essay called Dividing the Archive, and thinking about almost like a hierarchy that gets formed with photographic images once they become part of your everyday life, where there's images of you, and you think of people above you and then below you almost. And I'm thinking about that in relation to Douglass and his strategy. And like, what do you think about Douglass's strategy to photograph and get himself photographed rather? And then also, how did that photographic strategy or almost like an activist approach affect your thinking about evidence as it were, or come to selfhood even before evidence?
Yeah, definitely. Discovering that work, the work, I guess I'll in a book called Featuring, no, is it Featuring Frederick Douglass? I think so. Yeah, Featuring Frederick Douglass, when I discovered like how many, the massive collection of portraits of Frederick Douglass there were, and that was done on purpose on his behalf to really spread this kind of representation that he wanted for himself. And so I was in Atlanta. I was actually still in grad school at the time, and I learned of this book, and I went to the book launch. I think it happened at the Herndon home in Atlanta, Georgia. I was able to meet some descendants of Douglass and just kind of learn about the reasons why he did that. It was fascinating to me. And it was actually around the same time that I was making Come to Selfhood. I already started that body of work, but I was kind of working through the ideas, the portraits, and the handwritten text of what that project would be. And so when I discovered the work of Frederick Douglass, beyond just the essays that he wrote about photography, that's when it all clicked for me. So I began to really solidify that project based around the portraits that Frederick Douglass had made of himself. When you look at the pose, etc. Let's see, and then I think, evidence really didn't come until a few years later, after making Come to Selfhood, publishing the book, Come to Selfhood, speaking with Lyle Ashton Harris, doing a conversation. It was in New York City. I was in New York City 2016 working on the conversation for Come to Selfhood, and that's when Philomena Castile and Alton Sterling was killed by police within 2 days of each other. Well, no, right after each other, 2 days in a row. And then I found myself photographing protest again. And so that kind of went from a shift from doing Come to Selfhood to photographing protest. And you see that with my work constantly, right? And so that was a moment that kind of shifted my idea of making work, focusing on protest, focusing on, more of a studio practice, and making portraits. And so I wanted to kind of shift my work again after that, after photographing those protests. And I actually stopped photographing protests for a while. It wasn't until 2020 that I photographed protests again for George Floyd. So in that time period from 2016 to 2020, I focused on evidence, making portraits of young people in Atlanta and New York City. So the black and white images you'll see I made in Brooklyn, New York, of individuals that lived in New York City, but they're from across the country. They may have been in school or professionals in the area. And the rest were made on Morehouse College campus. And so just starting to investigate the idea of Black masculinity even more, ones who don't identify in that masculine identity, and then just kind of broadening the scope of that based on Douglass's approach.
Yeah, that's interesting to toggle between activism or documenting activism, experiencing it a little on the inside. Dr. Jenkins, I'm curious about your perspective on this coming from this kind of communications perspective about rhetoric and inclusion, and about the public figure and how that factors in this regard. Could you comment a little bit about that?
First of all, thank you for just the invitation of being able to share tonight regarding the outstanding work by Joshua, Rashaad McFadden. What stood out first to me in terms of this latest exhibit and what we're discussing tonight was the title, Evidence. When you think about my particular area of rhetoric, public address, that's what you look for, is evidence. And how do you support the arguments that one makes? You know, you think about logos, you think about pathos, and you think about the credibility of the person, the ethos. But what stood out here was not only the image that was presented of the participants, you know, in the work that you were engaged in, but also the narratives that supported those images. It gave us an opportunity to use the term sawubona. You know, that is a Zulu greeting that simply says, I see you, but beyond just seeing the individual, it goes to the heart of understanding and seeing them more in depth than just the facade or the image. And so the evidence is what stood out to me. And it really took me back to Frederick Douglass because of that link to Douglass, one of the more famous speeches that he gave here in Rochester, New York. It was given at Corinthian Hall. You know, what to the 4th of July, what to the Negro is the 4th of July. And some would refer to it as a 4th of July oration, but what he did, he dealt with that concept of what does it mean to be a man? And that stood out to me. You know, I just taught that a week ago. And it was that section where he asked the question, must we, you know, basically prove to you that the Negro is a man? And he ends up giving evidence after every question to demonstrate that he is a man. And for those who would doubt that, he says, you know, there's 72 crimes in the state of Virginia that if they are committed by a black man in this country, he would end up getting death. He said only 2 of those same crimes, if committed by a white man, would result in the same outcome. And he goes on to make this elaborated argument about the slave being a man, the black man being a man, and then he said, if he is a man, is he not entitled to liberty? And so he begins to pull together, seeing him first and foremost as a man and equal, and that gets into even your choice of how you chose to share evidence, and that is through a publication. And when you think about that publication in the same spirit of Frederick Douglass, he chose to use the North Star, and you chose to use your publication to do this. All of that ties together. So it was the title that stuck out most to me at the onset, was evidence, and how you back that up really through the narratives, the stories, and what individuals shared in terms of their own truths with others. And it was that which caused us to really reconsider, how do we look at man? How do we look at what it means to be male? How do we rethink all the things that we've been taught in that space? So that is what stands out initially with me.
Josh, Rashad, I wonder if you could follow up on that a little bit and talk about a few things that Dr. Jenkins brings up there. One is, you know, there's a tie in evidence to the I'm a Man, Martin Luther King Memphis activist event, and you asked the participants in that to comment on masculinity expressly. And then another point of the exhibition that I thought, this being the exhibition of Visual Studies Workshop, which we're seeing some images of here that a handful of people saw opening night. You asked individuals to comment in a way on masculinity, the way your participants in the archive did. And yeah, I wonder about that notion of increasing sort of the evidence and the thought about manhood and masculinity. And then lastly, this was the newspaper. If we'll take off from there. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. All of that stems from like the extensive deep dive I did into this idea of manhood, but also the discovery of Douglass's investigation into manhood, but also like proving humanity. That's what I found so fascinating. And so starting with what you mentioned, Tate, in the beginning of this project, which became Evidence, I really didn't have the title or the name for it, of course, in 2016 and 17. I was just kind of doing the work, trying just to kind of discover as I go. And when making the initial portraits that are in color, the photograph you'll see of Avery in the exhibition, I was thinking of the phrase, "I am a man," and that's because I recently did a story with Smithsonian Magazine with the same title about the sanitation workers' strike, in which their slogan that you read on their signs was, "I am a man." And I had the privilege to go to Memphis, Tennessee, and photograph participants, the people who were participants in that strike. The people who were there at Martin Luther King's last speech that he gave before his assassination in 1968. And so I was able to sit with them and talk about those experiences, in addition to making their portrait, meeting their family members, riding around Memphis with them, to see the businesses that they had or where they worked, to go to the union where all of this existed and started, and really talking about things that we're still talking about today, which is workers' rights, equal pay, safe working conditions. And so I found that phrase to be pretty fascinating, because now we're looking at that phrase and investigating it again as far as, what is a man, or maleness, and new ideas of gender, right? And so I was just wondering, well, how did that phrase back then, was it inclusive? Did everybody identify that way? So I just kind of wanted to turn that phrase like on its head with this new body of work, after completing that very important story with the sanitation workers. And so I continued on with evidence. Thinking about that phrase. And so that became one of the prompts that I asked the participants in evidence to respond to. I would say, here's the prompt, "I am a man, what do you think about it?" And I allowed them just to write. And so you'll see, on this yellow legal pad paper that I'm including more handwritten text than I included before with Come to Selfhood. And I wanted to think about that text as a standalone piece, the language, to give importance to that language and to what they think about these things, manhood in America, identity, masculinity, and then also humanity, proving humanity. So getting back to Frederick Douglass, looking at more of his writings when I was in residency at Visual Studies Workshop, continuing this work, I discovered that he wrote about manhood and humanity a lot. And so I said, interesting. Is he, on one hand he's talking about, okay, yes, manhood, and, I am a man, so I deserve these rights. But also, the evidence part came in when I said, okay, we're using these things, Black people using these things to prove humanity to the state, right? Because we were not seen as human. It had to be written into law that Black people are human beings. It blew my mind, that he was using photography to prove that, along with the newspaper, along with his speeches and text. And so that's when I discovered that, okay, I need to bring all of these things together, in a newspaper like his, the North Star paper. Then when we discovered the North Star papers, Rochester Public Library, I went down and I just figured they should probably have some of these papers, and they did, and I began to read them, and there was an essay in one of those papers about the very same thing. I believe we had it on display in the show, and one of the essays, again, he talks about manhood, being a man, and he underlined that word, man. And this is in, the 1800s. So I found it just interesting that, like, the repetition throughout time, that we continue to have to prove humanity over and over and over again, and that, on those signs, in the sanitation workers strike, here it is again, I am a man. Frederick Douglass saying the same thing. Where that, I am a man. And then here we are again with evidence. Even though it's in a new way, people trying to prove their humanity to a greater society.
Yeah, one of the more striking experiences for me working on that exhibition and being in it for some time was to see the great distinctive differences between the North Star paper and the evidence paper that you had produced. And I'd be curious to hear both of you talk about a little, if you will, about the newspaper, analog media. Like why analog now? How does political speech or that form of communication, how does it function for you? What do you think about it in terms of it as a medium? One of the things that sticks out for me is the permanence of paper in that North Star exhibited work, where you are in tension with it, and the photographs you're dealing with one of the ways in which we have lasting evidence of materiality. But I'm curious about it in terms of like today, where social media is rife with political speech and communication and all these other mediums, and how that affects us, but distinctively differently with the newspaper. Maybe you can start, Dr. Jenkins, if you have any thoughts there.
The thing that strikes me about the newspaper is that you actually feel it. Okay, you hold it, you can turn the pages, and you can come back and turn the pages again and again, and hold on to that. So that was something that stood out to me, to be able to go through the stories, to be able to take a highlighter and go through and capture certain aspects of what was being shared, because you dealt with identity of being a man. But what I began to glean from the pages as I read through them and looked at the images were the different perspectives that each of the individuals brought to what it means to be a man. And that began to, I think, alter perceptions, and that's what I see a newspaper doing. It gives you that opportunity. You can get that through social media, but it's something about the newspaper being able to feel it that I think brings it to life in a very different way. And whether I put it in my office, put it on the desk, and come back, there are times when you pull it out and you read again. And so that is something that was very powerful to me. But the other thing that stood out from the newspaper aspect of it also was that it actually stimulates change in our thinking. But it was not something that was being forced. I thought about what you said in terms of the political communication aspect of it. I was teaching in class about extremists versus moderates. And it is the extremist who wants the immediate change. They would use more emotional proof than logical proof. They are generally further from mainstream thought in their thinking. Other things that stand out is that the language that they use is generally, I would say, more in your face types of language that may be offensive to some. But then you look at the individuals who are logical or more moderate. They don't push for that immediate change. What they push for is change, but they understand that change takes time. And as I read through and I looked at the images, I says, is there advocacy for an immediate change? And what I began to pick up was that there were truths that were being shared that were altering perceptions, but it didn't seem to be an urgency to bring about an immediate change. And I kept going back and looking to see how are they sharing their truths and how does that impact the reader as those truths are shared. And so it was just something to just go through it from that angle and just go through the stories again and again and again. And there was one excerpt that I had to write down. Does a black boy, it was that question, what exactly is a man? This phrase doesn't include the black man, trans men, femboys, etc. Does the black boy with flowers, on his tongue count? Does the black boy with the golden fingernails count? Does the black boy with Beyonce in the walk count? Who's left out? Black men want to be and feel normal, but cis hetero black men normally erase and ignore the intersections that come with being a black man. I feel like we are at a place now where we can simply say, I am. I am, period. I simply am. And that just sort of jumped out at me because it was the vulnerableness that this individual was willing to engage in to share that story. And then I thought about you. It took your building a relationship with the individual that gave them license to say, I can share as openly and as freely and feel safe in doing so. And so that on the pages sort of leapt out at me as the stories were shared.
That brings up a real clear thought for me about empathy and about your empathetic response to, and I won't call them subjects in this case, to your participants, to your collaborators. And you're factored in your archive. I mean, you're factored in your work in the sense that you and your father are part of Come to Selfhood. The folks you photograph are very much connected to you and in dialogue with you. You use their names. We have their stories included. How do you think about empathy in relation to the work? And we often hear these calls for more empathy when horrible events happen, like being approved here, or other situations, mostly in the public sphere, and yet that has a cost when photographers are going out and reifying those images of folks that have been put into negative light through photography in wanted posters and in police archives where black bodies are policed more than white bodies, and so it's a really distinctive, different approach that you're taking where the inclusion is quite prevalent. And I'm curious what you're thinking when you're talking about feeling with others as you're making these works, particularly evidence and Come to Selfhood and
Sure. I think with making the work, well, let me back up. I think with just me and my relationship with the camera, I see the camera as more of an extension of myself. It's a part of me and my being. And so when I take that and apply it like my life's practice, and approaching these projects, it's how I treat people and how I want to be treated. What is the saying? Treat people in the way that you want to be treated. And that's really just how I try to approach every single project. And the thing is, it takes time. It takes a longer time to do things that way. But it should be done that way because you have to get to know people first. You talk about the relationship with the sitter, the relationship with the participants in my projects. And people wonder how can they be so comfortable to share their experiences, to be vulnerable. A lot of times, the participants have never been asked these questions. And what does that mean? Maybe no one has even cared to ask. And we have to think about that. You have to sit with that idea that no one has cared to ask these young people how they felt about these things that are going on and have been going on in this country. And that's what's been said today. I remember once after, a photo session, and they've completed their writings, and I just asked, well, how do you feel? And they said, you know what? Nobody's ever asked me any of these questions, and so I appreciate it. So you have to think about how therapeutic this could be, to be able to free themselves from these thoughts and get them out on paper. And I see that happen so much when I do these projects. It's even different than doing an interview and then just asking verbally, how do you feel about this? But for them to sit and actually write, it kind of shifts that the approach, it shifts that narrative. And so, that's really it.
Well, it's really interesting. I want to point out a couple of things, just the idea of really settling in. Like Dr. Jenkins, you mentioned this idea that there's not a forceful push with the work, and that one settles in because you're reading these narratives. I also think the photographs settle in, require settling in, in part because they're darker than some photographs, in my experience at least. When I'm looking at the grayscale images, particularly, they have a low-key tone, and you use dark color spaces for exhibiting the works, whether they be like navy blue when we did the exhibition at Visual Studies Workshop, or the wallpaper segment here. I mean, it's remarkable how your body has to kind of settle in and get with the materiality that's there. I want to ask you about that as a strategy, but I also want to point out this kind of anecdote that I brought to your all's attention over email. But Josh Rashad knows as well. When we were making Evidence, the newspaper, we were trying to get the black and white images, the grayscale images, printed darker than they would do it. And we were dealing with all these producers in Buffalo, newspaper printers, for years, that all these white guys over 50 who were like, no, you can't print these that dark because the paper's too spongy and it won't be seen. And ultimately, we rejected proofs that they then rejected themselves and went ahead and printed them lighter anyway, which was quite a frustration in the sense that, who controls production, who controls the end results in this case, and how these works are going to be seen. And I think of it as like relative to where we sit, with photographic production. It was, created in essence for the everyday person through what George Eastman had produced, but that was a particular point of view and perspective, and we're just now kind of coming to terms more with how film and lighting and other things have affected work. So I'm curious about your thoughts on, key, tone, like nerdy things about, photography in a way. It made me really question, like, what is white balance? And, that's a fascinating kind of terminology that I'm starting to kind of get out of my language about certain, ways of thinking about imagery. So if you could comment on that and just about, production a little bit. I have another question following up with you, Dr. Jenkins, about some of these same issues.
I mean, that's a long, there's a long history and story to go along with that question. I think my first experience with kind of control over how Blackness is photographed or imprinted probably started when I was in grad school, and I did a project that was actually about skin tone in Black women, and I remember printing them, and they came out nice. I printed them myself, and one of the first comments or questions was wow, it's hard to photograph black skin. How'd you do that? And I was just kind of shocked at that comment because I am black. So it was a weird question to ask because it's not asked, about white people. Like, well, how'd you photograph that skin?
Yeah, it's just like this norm that,
Yeah, so that was that, and that was over, that's over 10 years ago now. Well, getting there, almost 10 years. And that kind of changed how I guess, navigate through the industry. Further down the line, I also, of course, discovered and began, I guess my love affair with Roy Carava's work, who, is probably my favorite photographer. When discovering Roy Carava's work and the dark tones of this work, really spoke to me because that was a sort of activism in the work. Because again, a lot of times people will ask for those tones to be bright. If there's a dark-skinned person to be photographed, you'll see a lot of times that their skin is bright in post, which I don't think is right. And so that's a constant thing that we get, like, those shadows are a bit dark, or their skin's a bit dark, and it's their skin, and it should be celebrated because it is dark. And if a dark-skinned person or a black person in general is standing in the shadows, that's okay. And it's, I started to just change my mind about those things and be okay with those dark, rich tones that should be celebrated. And that's kind of permeated how I approach everything in my work. You mentioned the shadowiness of the exhibition, and when speaking with Heather, the curator, and Nick, I was very adamant about it being dim and bringing it down. It's like, really, how dim? Very dim. And it's a part of the vision that I guess only I can see, and then you'll be able to experience when it's done. So with the newspaper and the going back and forth, which kind of delayed the project so much, right? And getting those proofs back, and they brightened the photos anyways. It was a bit devastating, right? And we were like, this is not what we wanted. It just wasn't new. It wasn't like a new thing that happens, but
yeah, I really, it's in hindsight, but in sort of segueing to Dr. Jenkins a little, think of it as like there's institutions here, and they're established and they're difficult to upend. You have a tough job in the sense that you're an associate provost, vice president of a big institution, thinking about diversity and inclusion, which that institution has been established, and their sort of neural pathways, or the construction of its infrastructure has been established for a long time, perhaps, with some levels of diversity and inclusion in mind, but it takes upending those structures, I would imagine. What are your thoughts on that? Is it easier, better to start from scratch? You have to make those inroads? What is your philosophy in thinking about some of these infrastructural changes that we're facing?
I'll go back to the extremists. The extremists would say, don't trust the institutions, tear them down and build new ones. But these institutions, they're hard to change. And so you don't just tear them down and start anew. But I think we have to restart the conversations. And I think that's what evidence allows us to do, is restart conversations. As we read, we learn, we see, and we see anew, then it generates new insights and different conversations. So I think that as an institution, what is required is taking the time to pause and really deal with and connect with the populations that are there. You know, Joshua referred to the relationship aspect. I think we have to establish the relationships and reestablish the relationships. What are the voices that we haven't heard? What is it thinking? No one has ever asked me that question before. So what are the questions that we need to start asking? And so I think we have to rethink even the questions that we're asking, the knowledge that we're seeking, and then listen and hear in order to understand what needs to be changed. I think we can look at so many models out there and try to replicate them, but the models that we could pick up and try to replicate here may not work here. So we need to listen and try to understand. But it's a slow process. I wish I could say that it was a quick process. Even at RIT, they would argue they've been at this for decades. But still, there's so much more to learn and so much more that has to change.
There's a philosopher named George Yancey down in Atlanta, but he talks about tarrying time, and having to. What I'm reminded of in what you just spoke of is the speed aspect, and going back to the newspaper and into your comments earlier about having the opportunity to revisit and the slowness of that medium as opposed to the rapid pace of Instagram or whatever, TikTok, whatever it is that is in our face. But this idea of tarrying and how much time we can take leads to deeper results, deeper feelings about what is at stake and what's occurring. I think we're about at this point where we could open it up for a couple of questions. If there are any here in the audience, we have 5 minutes or so for that, and then we can always take some around.
Since we got a late start, we're going to go just a little after 7. So if you want to continue the conversation for a little longer, that's okay. If you still have questions, or we can open it up to the audience, however you will.
I'll bring in one more idea here, because I was really fascinated in your bio, Dr. Jenkins, that you have some research into gospel rhetoric. And I'm curious about quietude and power and the dynamics of Joshua Rashad's work. If there's any relationship that you see here between sound and song, particularly because Joshua Rashad's, as we were talking about, with this kind of settling in and the quietude and the strength of quiet and feeling in the work, but then the more let's say buoyant, blatant, the larger prints of protests and documentation, which also have quietude in them too. But I'm curious what you think of, is there a relationship here with gospel rhetoric and this kind of quietude dynamic that's happening with the work?
Yeah, you already went there with Terry.
Oh.
And because it is that aspect of just lingering and waiting, there's a power in that to me. And I thought about when I went to the exhibit, it is that image of Oxford, Mississippi, where they did not wait for the jury to render a verdict. They took a gentleman out and they hung him. And as I sat there and I looked at the space where that occurred and the images that were there, it took me back to a space in Arkansas, where I'm from. And we only referred to it as the hanging tree. That was the way they would give directions. They would say, go around the bend by the hanging tree. And I often think about that space. And I said, why did they call it that? And it was because that's where lynchings did occur. And so when I looked at that space, it was the tarrying that really jumped out at me. Because there is a power in that. I may not be able to vocally say anything but that guttural even in song, is something that's very powerful. So that sort of call and response was there. looked at the images in that way.
One more thought here in relation to what I think of as a prominent thematic and motif in your work, Josh Rashad, is the family archive. And Thomas Allen Harris interviews you in this newspaper, and his work is really important with Family Pictures USA, and trying to, again, like broaden the spectrum of what we think of as family and people and pictures. I wonder what you think about caretaking in this work. Family pictures often require this sense of longevity, passing down. They're often paper. These days it's a little funky, in that regard. What do you think of caretaking? How are you going to caretake this collection? What do you think about other institutions like the Research Workshop, George Eastman Museum, others caretaking your work? How does that factor into your thinking or interest?
Yeah, sure. The archive is very important to me. Mining the archive, investigating things, archival materials such as the North Star newspapers and looking at those, but also the personal archive of documents and family photographs and things like that. And actually, I guess my rank has gone up recently, in my family as far as the family archivist. Since the show opened, I guess I've been dubbed the family archivist. So now I'm just kind of, I'm dealing with that now. But recently, my great-great-grandfather passed. He was here in Rochester. He was 97 years old, veteran, and was at Pearl Harbor when it was attacked. And a few years ago, actually, when I did the residency at Visual Studies Workshop, I interviewed him and asked him about his experiences at Pearl Harbor and his experiences growing up in Florida and then coming to Rochester, New York to work, part of that great migration, and then eventually bringing my great-grandmother along with him, et cetera, et cetera. And with his passing, I think even more and more I'm seeing the importance of gathering that information. I guess, like you said, caretaking, taking care of that history, taking care of that evidence that he was here and that he fought for this country, for a country that did not fight for him. And that sticks with me. And a lot of those photos stick with me. And you'll see the installation of family photographs. It's over 100 photographs that from both sides of my family. And you can feel, at least I can. You can feel the photographs, you can feel the things that they've been through, you can feel the good times, the bad times. And I think a lot of people don't know how those types of photos can be important and can serve as a tool to document and convey, humanity, convey love and joy and pain, and to see them kind of work together in that space is important. It's very important.
Yeah, I would say too that there's a distinctive sense of collective authorship with family photos. Like the person who's taking the picture is not in the picture, and you're in your archive, and you're also outside it, collecting it and taking care of it in this expansive way, which I find I guess collective humanity in it as opposed to individual authorship or individual humanity, which is is a way in for more people in how you practice.
For sure, because you can begin begin to say, I identify with this. I also have a family and loved ones, and we have certain rituals, birthdays. You see a lot of photographs of birthday parties, Christmas, different holidays. And it goes beyond, I guess what surrounds that archive, the photographs of protest, things we have to deal with out in society. But when you get those home images, those family images in the home, start to shift that narrative. It starts to show a different side of living here in America.
Great, that's wonderful. Is there time for one question?
I was mistaken. I cannot walk around with a microphone
Oh,
because we
I
can't
see.
share one. So if anyone is
Holler.
feeling like they can yell loud enough, or I can yell for them.
Todd?
Hi, hopefully I didn't get up and balcony so I could yell, but thank you three so much for this incredible conversation. It's been really moving and enlightening for me. I'd like to ask a question about the comparison between perhaps Frederick Douglass's 4th of July oration and evidence. And I think one of the very striking things about Frederick Douglass's oration is that it uses examples of illogical practices to prove a point through logic, paradoxically in some way. And Joshua, evidence, the imagery is so emotionally raw and charged, as well as the handwritten sentiments and messages that the subjects are sharing, both of which Frederick Douglass and evidence are stating that claim of I am a man. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the differences between logic and emotion in proving that point.
Thank you. Well, I think that for a long time we've tried to separate those things and use logic to prove our humanity to society, right? Because we were made to be separate, right? As far as, black and white, separate and unequal. And so the greater society, white people felt like they could not identify and feel and empathize for Black Americans. So why use emotions to try to convey our humanity? Let's use logic, let's use law, let's get this in the books to say that it's unethical and not right to deny human rights to African Americans in this country. But going for so long without acknowledging the fact that we are emotional beings is also violent and destructive, right? And so now we're dealing with that. We're still dealing with the remnants of people not being able to say, I feel you. You know what I'm saying? When young Black people are killed by police, people go to the logic and they go to, what were they doing? So they had to do something. And they're not saying, but this child was killed by police and they were unarmed. They can feel that they had a family and that there's a mother, right, that doesn't have their child. We think about Emmett Till and that she used the photograph so that people, the photograph of the open casket so that people can start to feel that beyond what was written in newspapers that may have negated the fact that he was lynched. Then again, same thing, Trayvon Martin, the hoodie. He must have stormed with somebody. Let's use logic to dehumanize. Beyond the fact that his mother wanted to just celebrate his birthday this month. And And so that's why I continue to connect to the emotional aspect and to not deny the humanity of these young people. Yeah.
Great question. I apologize, we do have to end the conversation here. Let's see if this is working. Hello? Okay, yes. So I apologize, we do need to end the conversation here. We got to empty out the theater so we can get it ready for our film tonight. But I do want to thank you all for coming here, and please thank our guests this evening.